Well, when we were trying to think of a name for the film and the book, we weren't trying to be masters of the obvious by calling it Dirty Wars. I mean, there's no such thing as a clean war, but rather it was a reference to this prior era in U.S. foreign policy where the CIA and the U.S. military were assassinating political figures in Central and Latin America and Africa and elsewhere around the world. It really tipped off with the overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala in the early 1950s, the overthrow of Salvador Allende, the support for Pinochet's rise, support for the Contra death squads in Nicaragua, support for juntas and death squads in other Central and Latin American countries, murdering African popular nationalist leaders. And the CIA and the U.S. military have always worked hand in glove together. So it's not that somehow there's a new way of waging war. Very little ever changes in war except for technology. What I think is important for people to understand about the current moment we're in is that under President Obama, in particular, the CIA has really radically moved back to its paramilitary role. There was a while in the 1990s under Bill Clinton when the CIA was largely put in a cage. It's not that they weren't active or they didn't do paramilitary operations. It's that they weren't being given an aggressive mandate to hit all over the world. Now, under Obama, you not only have the CIA acting as a paramilitary organization again, you have these elite U.S. military forces, primarily from the Joint Special Operations Command, that have been given wide latitude to conduct what they call kinetic operations, direct actions in nations around the world. So they've been very empowered under this White House. And President Obama, I think it's not about whether Obama's worse than Bush or better than Bush. The real issue here is that because Obama is who he is, the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, a constitutional lawyer by trade, a Democratic president who was elected on a very popular mandate to change things, he's made an argument, a political argument, that he somehow has figured out a cleaner way to wage war, a more effective way to wage war. And to me, that's going to be one of the most devastating, enduring legacies of his administration, is that he's convinced liberals in the United States in particular that assassination is somehow acceptable and perhaps even legal.
Yeah, the Black Panthers called him the best secret weapon that the right wing ever invented.
Well, if you look at the last time there was a Democrat in the White House, Bill Clinton, and you look at his domestic agenda in particular, I mean, on a foreign policy level, Clinton was a very aggressive hawk. He was not somehow some kind of a dove, despite his history of opposing the Vietnam War as a young person. I mean, this is sort of the classic story of all modern Democrats. They're 10 degrees to the left of center in good times, 10 degrees to the right of center, and if it affects them personally, as Phil Oakes said. But what I really think that we're seeing, what we saw when Clinton was president, is that he took the Republican agenda domestically within the United States on issues of crime, on issues of drugs, on issues of prisons, on free trade agreements, NAFTA and GATT, and all of these things. And he basically functioned as a right-wing conservative on all of those issues. And then on foreign policy, there's very little difference between the Democrats and Republicans. When you look at Barack Obama, he has this almost cult-like following of people who will defend anything he does, to the point where people will support policies, liberals will support policies because Obama is implementing them, that if a Republican had tried to get away with it, they would be screaming for impeachment. So what does that mean? Well, it means that Obama has been a very effective manager of U.S. empire. He has been able to expand U.S. military operations, neoliberal economic policies, in a way that I think there would have been more resistance if a Democrat was in office, if a Republican had been in office. And so, on that level, I think people are right who say, that Obama really has been a great Republican president because he sort of cleaned it up for them next time around. The next time someone like similar to a Bush or a Cheney comes into office, liberals in the United States are going to have very shaky ground to stand on in criticizing them because they've been cheerleading it under Obama. Well, I mean, I think it's fair to say that, under President Obama's administration, the U.S. government has been waging a war against journalism and against journalists. On the one hand, you have a White House that will engage in its own leaks. They want to go after WikiLeaks, but then they do official leaks where, they're feeding stories to journalists that make them look like the noble defenders of peace, freedom, and democracy in the world. They fed all sorts of details about the raid on Osama bin Laden. Many of them turned out to be outright lies or false. And at the same time, they're prosecuting in record numbers whistleblowers and other critics of the government. and they're subpoenaing phone records of journalists, sometimes using the law. Other times they're just taking the phone records using the National Security Agency. They're seizing internet service provider records of people. You know, if you get served, if an internet service provider gets served with papers called the National Security Letter, what basically the government is saying is we demand access, and the companies are required to give it, to all of the digital communications of a specific customer, of Google or AOL or Hotmail, Yahoo, and the owner of that ISP, the head of Yahoo, the head of Google, what have you, they're not allowed to say to the account holder that they've been targeted. They're not allowed to say publicly that they've had to do this, because they'll be prosecuted for doing so. So you don't really have a way of knowing if you're under surveillance. At the same time, journalists have been named in indictments of whistleblowers. There have been threats and acts of intimidation against journalists. President Obama, and we show this in our film, intervened at one point in the case of a Yemeni journalist who was imprisoned for being an opponent of his government's regime, and also for exposing U.S. missile attacks in Yemen that the U.S. was denying. Obama directly intervened and kept that journalist in prison. So if you look at that and you look at the aggressive way that they're trying to go after journalists who are cultivating independent sources and not just taking official government propaganda, it really is a war on the press. Well, I think all of us who cover sensitive issues or deal with confidential sources or whistleblowers have to face a new reality in the digital age, and that is that I think you should assume that your communications are being intercepted, if not by governments, by corporations or powerful individuals. I mean, we all have such a massive digital footprint now that you would be reckless not to try to take steps to ensure it. It's akin to leaving your door unlocked in a neighborhood filled with violent crime and putting a sign outside of your house saying, "Come on in and take everything." So, one part of it is that you have to learn how to effectively use encryption software. It's not foolproof, but at least you want to make their job more difficult if they're trying to get into your communications. But also, it's almost like you have to become a Luddite of sorts when you're dealing with sources, and you have to meet with people in person and leave the phone at home. And I've had that experience myself with sources where people don't want to be around a mobile phone. We know the technology exists to remotely turn on the microphones and cameras of cell phones and computers. So being aware is the first step. But I mean, what I care about more than my own personal information is protecting people who could potentially go to jail for talking to me. I always give an assurance to my sources that I promise them I will never testify against you in court. I will never reveal your identity. I would go to jail before I would do that. But that's not enough. Even if you mean it, you have to take steps to ensure that your communications are as secure as possible. But hey, we're living in a world where the most powerful nations in the world, the United States, Britain, China, Russia, are in many people's communications. And I think that we only understand a fraction of how much surveillance they're doing, even though we've had the Edward Snowden documents published in The Guardian, Der Spiegel, and elsewhere. I think we've only hit the tip of the iceberg in terms of the vast surveillance network that's being run by these powerful nations. Right. I've talked to people who are drone pilots, and one of them who was based in the Southwest in the United States was describing to me how he is engaged in war operations over Pakistan and Yemen from the middle of a desert in the United States, far, far away, and he's bombing targets in those areas by remote control. And then he gets into his vehicle at the end of the day and he buckles his seatbelt and he drives off base, and there's a sign that says, make sure you have your seatbelt on because this is the most dangerous part of your day. Meaning he could get into a car accident and be killed before he's going to be killed in the war zone where he's an active participant in bombing another country. So it's a way of sanitizing war, where you do turn it into a video game of sorts. I also think that it's indicative of an intelligence failure, because drones and missiles launched from the sea are sort of a replacement for actually gathering real intelligence that you can verify. It's much easier to say, well, every military-age male in this region of Yemen or this region of Pakistan who we kill, we're just going to go ahead and say that they're a terrorist after the fact. And that's what the U.S. has been doing in certain areas of Yemen and Pakistan for a number of years now, particularly under President Obama. So, what they're engaged in really is preemptive war. And of course, this raises all sorts of questions about international law. It raises questions under the U.S. Constitution. American citizens have been targeted and assassinated on orders from President Obama. And these are people that have never actually been charged with a crime in the United States relating to terrorism. And so what you have is the President of the United States serving as the prosecutor, the judge, the jury, and then ultimately the executioner of not only American citizens but scores of non-Americans. And part of the position that many nations around the world find themselves in is that the United States dictates the rules. It's victor's justice. So the international law is valid to the United States only insofar as it advances U.S. interests. The International Criminal Court, Democrats and Republicans alike refuse to ratify it. Why is that? Well, they don't want U.S. personnel subjected to the same standards of law for the Milosevic's of the world or the leaders of the genocide in Rwanda. That's for Balkanized countries. That's for African nations. So, on the one hand, Bashar al-Assad, I agree, is a war criminal. I would love for him to be prosecuted at an international criminal court. But the only way that that court would have any real legitimacy globally is if it also had jurisdiction over the United States when its leaders order strikes that kill civilians. People like to beat up on Al Jazeera because it's owned by the Qatari monarchy. The Emir of Qatar is there's a relatively new Emir of Qatar. He's deeply involved with all of these U.S. wars around the world. Qatar has been involved with Libya, was a major investor in post-Mubarak Egypt, and you do see the influence of the Qatari government bleeding into Al Jazeera's coverage, particularly Al Jazeera Arabic. Al Jazeera English and Arabic are a bit different. But lest we sort of go too far down that road without putting it in context, in the U.S., large media corporations are owned in part by weapons manufacturers who stand to benefit, from their toys being used in all of these wars. And you have a media culture in the United States where advertising revenue trumps news judgment. So if advertisers say, we don't really like this news show that you have on during prime time, we'd rather watch rich women in Beverly Hills playing with their poodles and drinking Pinot Grigio, well, that's what's going to be on TV. So, on the one hand, yeah, Al Jazeera has issues that are raised by the ownership of its network. The United States has the exact same thing, and for, I think, far more nefarious players involved, So, I think in general, there's a kind of bankrupt media culture around the world, and that's why I think a lot of independent-minded journalists are trying to think of alternative ways of cultivating the news, of presenting information to people that is independent and not reliant upon the funding of huge corporations or major, governments, dictators, monarchs, what have you. It's difficult to quantify, how many people are seeking out independent information and how many people are content to sort of be, sheeps being led to the media slaughter. My sense is that with the rise of the internet age, particularly with social media tools like Twitter, Tumblr, Facebook, you have a lot more information out there immediately available. There's an extraordinary phenomenon that's occurred particularly with Twitter, where people are being fact-checked in real time. And so when a major media outlet puts out information that's false or twisted or one-sided, ordinary people can call it into question, and it can go viral, and it can force them to retract or change their stories. It happens all the time now. The danger, though, is that you get away from credible systems of producing media, where you have fact checkers and editors and legal review. So I think that the verdict is still out on that. My sense from traveling around the world is that people are hungry for independent sources of information. The game is up. People sort of realize that these big corporate media outlets have been feeding them a lot of bullshit for so long. And the question is going to be, who's going to step in to build these alternatives. Al Jazeera just launched a channel in the United States, Al Jazeera Americas. Now, it's starting off very slow. It's very tiny. There are big fights with cable providers whether or not to allow Al Jazeera to be on cable networks or satellite networks, particularly because of the way that wars are covered today, where a lot of the best coverage is coming from unfamous non-Western journalists. People are seeking out alternative sources of information. The world also is in tough economic times. So how do you fund that kind of media? That's the debate and discussion I'm engaged in every day. How do you build independent sources of media that are sustainable, credible, but also recognize that we live in a very fast-paced, short attention span society right now? You become a professional beggar when you're an independent journalist. I don't have any one employer. I don't have a job with health benefits or a retirement plan. I myself and a few other people have tried to figure out a way to carve out a way of surviving and doing what we think is important work. A lot of it involves spending at least a couple of months a year begging for money. Some of it comes in the form of applying for grants, some asking for donations. Some of it is doing work you don't particularly want to do to fund something you do want to do, and it's hit or miss. I had many years where like the most money I made would be like $11,000 or $12,000 and had no health benefits because I was passionately working on something that no one was going to pay me to do. And then other years I'm able to afford to buy health care, but it's it really is feast or famine sometimes in the world of independent media. And I do a lot of work with younger journalists. I used to consider myself a young journalist until I started getting gray hair, maybe from being in war zones or just from getting older. But I really try to encourage young people who want to get involved with international reporting to not just get in the internship game where you're bouncing from being a coffee runner to being a coffee runner, but to do a job that doesn't drain your brain for 6 months or a year and save all of your money up so that you can make a run at actually trying to report from the place you want to go to. And if you can't get someone to give you an assignment, then give yourself an assignment and take yourself seriously as a journalist. I truly believe that we've bought into this lie that journalism needs to be taught at universities and that you have to learn some specific style of reporting. You're really just manufacturing lemmings and robots when you do that. To me, journalists should have dirt under their fingernails, should be out in the real world, should be talking to people and traveling and interacting with the people wherever they are. And that's not necessarily taught in the classroom, and it's not necessarily the best place to learn it. To me, it's like being a plumber or an electrician. The best way to learn those trades is to do it under someone that knows what they're doing. So I try to take younger journalists under my wing also and give them real world experience and not just having them running errands for me. I think young people should be, especially those where the fire burns in their heart to be journalists, which is really the only reason you should get involved with journalism. It's certainly not a lucrative career for most people, is because you believe in it. It's almost like a way of life rather than a job.